You're listening to Formosa Files. I'm Eric Michael Smith.
I'm John Ross.
And we are looking at the Second World War today. We won't be able to get through the whole thing, but when you think about Taiwan, it was called Formosa at the time, you don't really associate it with the Second World War, even though it's right smack dab there in the middle, Japan, the Philippines, China, right? But you don't think of it. You don't think of Formosa in the same way as Midway or Iwo Jima. This is weird.
Yes, obscure islands like Tarawa, Saipan, Okinawa.
But Taiwan, given its strategic location, was an important player. And I think more importantly, what many people haven't thought about or read about or learned is that it was a major point of consideration for war planners.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation.
Formosa Files.
Yeah, Taiwan's got a superb location. It's across from China, and it's also controlling the seaways to Japan. And the Japanese, they needed Taiwan for their expansion south. Even the idea for the southward push, that developed on Taiwan in the 30s. There were exponents of the so-called Southern Expansion Doctrine working at the university, Taihoku Imperial University.
Oh, which today is known as National Taiwan University. NTU, or Taida. It's located smack dab in the middle of Taipei and happens to be Taiwan's most prestigious university.
Yeah, so some of the professors at the university were Navy men, present and past, and they were writing up reports on the benefits of expanding Japan's reach, expanding the empire southward.
Okay, so you have the Japanese army, and they favor war on the Asian mainland.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, we're talking mostly China.
Yes.
And the Navy, they prefer a naval approach, not surprising. And they'd like to target Southeast Asia. So that would be Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Singapore, all of that. But the army is on the rise. They invade Manchuria, northeast China, 1931, establish a puppet state, a new country called Manchukuo. And then in the summer of 1937, they launch a full-scale war with China. And, you know, that's arguably when World War II actually started.
Yes, for me, that's the start of World War II. And 1937 marks a turning point for Taiwan. Japanese rule became increasingly militaristic, increasingly harsh from then on. There's greater pressure to assimilate, to become proper Japanese citizens. So the local people are pressured to speak Japanese, to change their names to Japanese ones. And they're also encouraged to give up, to forsake their traditional religious practices and take on Shintoism.
Interesting. That was not all that successful, however.
Nope.
Just after the Japanese were evicted from my city here in Kaohsiung, there was a Shinto temple on the top of a hill, and that was knocked down very quickly and turned into a martyr shrine. And to this day, we do not have any significant Shinto population in Taiwan.
Yeah, they failed on that and the names, but the language ability, that lasted.
If you were educated in any way, you spoke Japanese, and you and I have been here long enough to know that like 20 years ago, if you met an older person, there was a possibility they didn't speak Mandarin, but they would speak Taiwanese and Japanese.
Yes.
But, you know, in terms of fighting, Taiwan had it relatively easy. It's kind of surprising when you think about how little Taiwan was actually involved in the fighting of the Second World War. I'm talking about like men being conscripted into the Japanese army. If Taiwan was a colonial possession of Japan and it had been for decades, you would think that they would have, you know, extracted resources, men. But Taiwan didn't really provide all that many soldiers.
Yeah, it surprised me when I found out about that. I thought that they would be cannon fodder. But no, when war breaks out in the summer of 1937, Japanese troops on Taiwan are sent to China, but this army of Taiwan, they're Japanese. Taiwanese were not soldiers in this army. Even a couple of years later, when the Japanese are bogged down in China, bleeding men, there are 1 million Japanese soldiers in China. They're not conscripting colonials as soldiers. They need labor, so they took some Taiwanese as porters, laborers, hospital orderlies, interpreters.
But they're not armed. These are civilian Taiwanese people.
Yes, they started recruiting volunteer soldiers after Pearl Harbor. First the army, and then the following year the Navy, but relatively small numbers.
And you said recruiting volunteers. That means not conscription.
Yes, I think that was just in the final year, 45, they have conscription.
Whether they were volunteers or conscripts, combatants or not, I've looked at the numbers and it's really somewhere around 200,000 Taiwanese served in the Imperial Army and Navy. Half of those just stayed in Taiwan. The other half were sent overseas. And the numbers of dead is roughly 30,000.
Sounds right to me. So they're serving in China, in Southeast Asia, and the far reaches of empire, really. Burma, New Guinea. Oh, that place was a real death sentence. A short straw if you were sent there.
So, John, I was just watching an old American film, and it raised an interesting little line. Here's a little mystery question for you.
Fire away.
It's late 1941. So you're an American radio man on a ship. You're sitting out there at a Navy listening post. You're somewhere in the Pacific. You got your headphones on, you're tuned into a frequency used by the Japanese Imperial Navy, and you pick up a Japanese message, ... You know how that works, right? So you transcribe it, and it reads, Nitaka Yama no Bore.
That's vaguely familiar. Can you give it to me again?
My Japanese isn't fluent by any means, but something like Nitaka Yama no Bore.
What's that in English?
In English, that would be climb Mount Nitaka.
That's Mount Jade, isn't it?
Yep. Taiwan's highest peak, under 4,000 meters. And of course,
the highest peak in the Japanese Empire, huh?
At the time, right. Taiwan's mountains are higher than anything you can find in Japan. So, Yusan, Jade Mountain.
But what the heck does it mean? Can you give me a date for the message?
Right. The date was, and this will immediately conjure some reaction from you, December 1st, 1941.
This is awfully close to a date which will live in infamy,
right.
As Roosevelt said. So that's December 7th. So this is related to Pearl Harbor.
Exactly.
Is it ordering radio silence?
They've already had radio silence for nearly a week, and there's already suspicion and everything, but it's the final message from Yamamoto for the First Air Fleet to proceed with the planned surprise attack on Pearl Harbor.
Nice. Nice. Oh, not the attack, obviously, but the code phrase.
Right.
Climb Mount Nitaka.
Little Taiwan connection to Pearl Harbor that no one knows about.
Yeah. So Pearl Harbor is attacked on Sunday morning in the Philippines and Taiwan, where we're 6 hours behind. So let's say that's about 3 a.m. If you're General Douglas MacArthur in Manila, commander of the United States Army Forces in the Far East, and of course the Philippines is American at that time, what do you do?
Right. Okay. I'm Commander Douglas MacArthur in Manila. I get a telephone call or a telex, and I've learned about Pearl Harbor. The first thing I do is I scramble my planes and I bomb the hell out of airfields and ports and everything else in Taiwan because they're going to be able to be used against me. I would also safeguard my planes. They would be in the air the second the sun came up.
Yeah, it seems obvious, right?
Yes.
That's what the Japanese on Taiwan were expecting. They're expecting a visit by American B-17 bombers from Clark Airfield, 500 miles to the south.
But the Japanese Air Force is not going to just sit around and wait.
As dawn breaks at airfields across southern Taiwan, planes and pilots are ready to go.
Right.
But there's a heavy fog, so their departure is delayed by a few hours.
That should have given the Americans valuable time.
A pity they didn't use it because it's an absolute fiasco. They don't attack Taiwan. I can't go into the details. They're too messy and complicated. But MacArthur doesn't give permission for planes to attack Taiwan. He wants photo recon flights first. He wants some B-17s to go up and take pictures when they get back, and then they'll plan their raid. They're also waiting for the weather to clear.
So in the end, it wasn't the Japanese Air Force on Taiwan that was eliminated. It was the American Air Force that got hit.
There are a couple of attacks on the Philippines, and one of them is around noon.
So that's 9 hours after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
9 hours after Pearl Harbor, America gets hit again on the Philippines from Taiwanese bases.
The Americans have put planes into the air, a holding pattern. They're waiting. They're going to go to Taiwan in the afternoon, but they're back on the ground, and they're caught on the ground by the Japanese. And B-17s destroyed, 30-something P-40 fighters destroyed in the air and ground. More than 100 planes in total.
What a double whammy of Pearl Harbor and then a horrible military decision that resulted in total loss of air, what should have been superiority at that point. So the American Air Force is decimated. Taiwan then is not going to be bombed.
Not for a few years, but it will get more than enough ordnance a few years later when the American Air Force returns to the region and bombing becomes common from late 44. They're hitting targets of military and strategic value, but of course, civilians do die in those attacks. Things got hot with the Formosan air battle mid-October 1944.
Right. I pulled up Wikipedia to see what this was about. That's a series of large-scale aerial engagements between American carrier groups and Japanese land-based air groups. Wikipedia puts it this way. The battle consisted of American air raids against Japanese military installations on Taiwan during the day and Japanese air attacks at night against American ships. Japanese losses exceeded 300 planes destroyed in the air, while American losses amounted to fewer than 100 aircraft destroyed and 2 cruisers damaged.
Ooh, brutal. So after that, the Japanese in desperation start their suicide attacks, kamikaze.
Right.
The Formosan air battle is a lead up to the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines later that month in October. It's the largest naval battle of the war, as far as I know. It's a crushing defeat for Japan. The Americans begin their liberation on October 20th. They're landing troops and one especially important soldier.
Yep, you don't have to tell me who that is. That would be our pipe-smoking famous General MacArthur. And he made that "I have returned" speech. You got that famous photo of him wading ashore, fulfilling his promise to return.
Yes, and seeing as we've brought up MacArthur and his promise to return, here's a question for you. It's probably the most important day or 2 days of the Second World War for Taiwan. It's July 26, 27th, 1944. MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Forces in the Southwest Pacific, has flown to Honolulu from Australia. And ailing Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, has come by ship. And the highest-ranking U.S. military man, reporting only to the president himself, William D. Leahy.
So the question is, what are all these high-ranking people doing together, yeah?
Yeah.
I suppose they would be deciding on strategy. The question was whether or not to invade Taiwan or liberate the northern Philippine island of Luzon, home to the capital city of Manila, right? And MacArthur, because he had obviously promised that he would return and he had been unceremoniously, sort of kicked out, he was probably very much in favor of the Philippine option. But from what I understand, it wasn't a complete universal agreement on that.
Indeed. So MacArthur is going to have to make a very good case at this conference in Honolulu. The man pushing the Formosa plan outranks him, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral King and many of the Joint Chief of Staff planners preferred to bypass Luzon and take Taiwan. Even had a date for it. Occupation of Formosa, target date February 15, 1945, and it's called Operation Causeway. But King has not been invited by Roosevelt to the conference. Likewise, Chief of Staff George Marshall.
So Admiral King, Chief of Naval Operations, is in favor of occupying Formosa, and he's even got a date for it, the 15th of February, 1945, but he's not invited to this crucial meeting to decide strategy. Do we know why?
Not really. The explanation I've seen is that FDR wanted to hear open views from the two Pacific Theater commanders, MacArthur and Chester Nimitz. Roosevelt already knew King and Marshall's take on wrapping up the Pacific War.
But you can't imagine that Admiral King would have been happy about being kept out of probably one of the most important meetings of the Pacific War.
No, he wasn't. He had to rely on Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz to present the case for Formosa. There weren't any minutes taken at this meeting, so historians don't know. We don't know exactly what they said. MacArthur wrote memoirs, but unreliable. But it seems MacArthur was very forceful, presented his side well. Nimitz was a bit weak. He was lukewarm on invading Formosa. He was in two minds about how to do it as well. If I recall correctly, he had a twist on just occupying Taiwan. He wanted to just take southern Taiwan and at the same time capture an area on the Chinese mainland around Xiamen.
Interesting. That would have been a very different way to end the war, huh? Southern Taiwan and a bit of primitive shaman. So FDR and his friend Leahy, they go ahead and they give MacArthur's Luzon idea the stamp of approval. Mm-hmm. And okay, I'm also of two minds about this when I think about whether or not, if it was me, if I would have gone to the Philippines or I would have taken Taiwan. Taiwan had been a Japanese colony at this point for roughly 50 years. You know, they were pretty dug in. It would have been a pretty nasty fight taking Taiwan. I'm sure the U.S. Navy and military knew that. And then for the Filipino people who had been under the American wing, you got all those American POWs there, and MacArthur had made that famous promise, right? So you can see why it's kind of a strong case to go for the Philippines.
It's a strong case militarily, morally. It's also politically convenient for Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. He has a record fourth election looming November that year. And reading between the lines, MacArthur is promising he's not going to make trouble election time for Roosevelt if he gets what he wants.
Yeah, interesting. For people who don't know the U.S. history of elections, there wasn't actually a law that said you had to serve only 2 terms at that point. It had been tradition because George Washington had served 2 terms and retired. So all the other ones had done that. But then Roosevelt came along and there was the Great Depression and all of that. And he went 2 and he was like, I think I'll have another one. And at this point, he's going into his 4th election. But after this, there would be a constitutional amendment passed in the U.S. that would change that. So Roosevelt, the only U.S. president to serve more than 2 terms.
Yeah, he died in office, died the following year, April 45.
Yeah, a little sad that he didn't get to see the final victory of his efforts. But by the time he passed away, it was pretty clear which way the war was going. So I just said that for me personally, it's a struggle to decide whether or not I would have picked Luzon over Taiwan. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? I favor Formosa.
Really? Yeah. Okay. Give us your reasoning.
Okay, so at this stage, the Americans are sure of victory, right? They should be looking ahead, years ahead, decades ahead to how things will play out. The big picture is you want to defeat the Chinese communists and to stop Soviet designs on the Far East. I trust the men at the time and the decisions they made. But having said that, with the benefit of hindsight, yes, I think China needed to be involved.
But John, you said that America should have been looking ahead. You should know by now that we don't do that. We just jump in.
You're not a proper imperial power. You've not had enough practice.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So although I fault the medium and long-term strategy, the short-term planning for Formosa wasn't bad.
Okay.
I'd like to have a look at some of the war planning for Operation Causeway. Eric, you know I'm something of a bookworm, right?
Well, yes. In fact, I recorded the audiobook for your book, Taiwan in 100 Books, so I happen to know that quite well, yes.
Yeah, so indulge me here as I dive into the biblio world. Some books I didn't mention in my book about Taiwan books. The biggest series of English language books on Taiwan ever written was produced by the United States Navy.
Oh.
The OPNAV, Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. This is a series of civil affairs handbooks, a few on a range of specialized topics, and then one for each region of Taiwan.
Interesting.
These were for the expected invasion and post-invasion administration of Formosa. So these books, which come with illustrations, are packed with details. Very dry, yet practical information, and the occasional nugget.
Yeah, when you say very dry, I'm assuming very, very dry.
Well, I found out that my town, then home to a population of 10,000, had 13 Formosan doctors and 1 Japanese doctor. The bus trip to Chiayi City cost 35 sen. And from the local port, a small port, exports are said to be salt, glass jars, animal bones, and honey.
Animal bones?
I'm only passing on what I read.
Okay. So that qualifies as a nugget of information?
Okay, so a hard to please audience here. Try this one. You remember in a previous podcast, we talked about Hirohito's visit.
Yes, the Crown Prince of Japan, who came to Taiwan for a 10-day trip back in 1923, so pretty much 100 years ago.
Yeah, there's mention of his visit to the Heito sugar factory in Pingtung City. In preparation for the visit, some bamboo from Taichung actually was cut and an arbor constructed.
An arbor, that's like a trellis, right? Where vegetation overhead, it provides shading. So it would be like a pleasant spot for the Crown Prince to rest. And Pingtung is hot.
Yeah. Alas, his trip was delayed by some weeks and it was feared that the bamboo would be withered, sad looking. But the bamboo took root, and miraculously, a few days before Crown Prince Hirohito's arrival, the bamboo burst into life again. So on the day of the visit, the bamboo had lovely fresh green sprouts. So the handbook says the holy clump of bamboo had become a memorial, and it reads, "Propaganda has created a sacred place of pilgrimage for all good Japanese. The site has no significance for the Formosan Chinese, who are well aware of the ease with which any cutting can be rooted in that warm, moist climate."
Ah, the holy bamboo.
The holy bamboo.
That is funny. And specifically just it bloomed because the great leader was coming for a visit. And all the Taiwanese are like, yeah, we watered it. Okay, so you're talking about the Civil Affairs Handbook made by the U.S. Navy.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to run through some of the place names, the titles of the books, and the publication dates. Okay. First up, the Civil Affairs Handbook for the Pescadores Islands, published September 1st, 1944.
That would be the Penghu Islands today.
Yep. 3 books published on October 1st for Tauco Province.
Takao would be Kaohsiung.
Tainan Province.
Still Tainan.
Karenko and Taito.
Those were the Japanese names for Hualien and Taidong, respectively, on the East Coast.
October 15, the last 3 books came out for Taichu, Shinjuku, and Taihoku.
Right, that's Taichung, Hsinchu, and Taipei. So nothing for Chiayi County or some other areas?
Well, the administration areas were different then. And Chiayi had to suffer the humiliation of being lumped in with Tainan.
Oh, the shame. But overall, that's pretty amazing. You got 7 books in a couple of months, and you said there are other books. I mean, to get that amount of information, such a short time, it's
yeah. But you know, if you're planning on conquering and ruling a country, even for a short time, you need information. Yeah, I mean, likewise, detailed intel is pretty important for one of the biggest amphibious landings in history. You're looking at 400,000 men for this Operation Causeway.
Okay, so that would make it much larger than the Normandy landings, commonly called D-Day, right? June 6th. That was only about 100,000 plus troops.
Yeah, but we've got to compare like with like. Normandy, Operation Overlord, probably got 1 million men there within a month.
Right.
But in terms of landing troops, not so dissimilar.
So perhaps a better comparison would be the Allied invasion of Sicily. So we got island to island, right? Sicily is a mountainous island, about a third smaller than Taiwan. And the Allies had to take that with, I forget how many troops. Yeah,
I looked it up before the recording. Sicily was 160,000 men initially, similar to Normandy. And then over 400,000 men on the ground at peak. And that was a 6-week campaign. So it's similar, yeah.
That's a huge force. And I guess I can understand why they need to do that immense amount of planning, but still rather impressive.
Yeah. One of the men compiling information was George Kerr, quite a famous name here.
Oh, yes. Very, very famous. George Kerr was the author of Formosa Betrayed.
Yeah.
He was the U.S. vice consul here from 1945 to 1947. This guy was an academic. He taught some English, and really he's best known for that book, Formosa Betrayed, where he tells stories from the 228 period and lots of other things.
Yeah.
The book basically argues that America and other countries could have done more to help Taiwan in its hour of need right after World War II, essentially.
Yes. His first job here was as an English teacher up in Taipei from 37 through to 1940. He planned to work here for just 6 months, but ended up staying longer.
That's going to sound quite familiar to many a foreigner listening.
Yeah, I'm raising my hand. He left Taiwan in 1940 to pursue a doctorate. He was studying Chinese and Japanese history at Columbia.
Oh, that's a very valuable skill set, just as the Japanese are attacking Pearl Harbor. I remember in his bio, he became a Formosa specialist for the Army. And then in 1943, he's transferred to the Navy to set up a Formosa research unit that produced these materials or some of these materials on Taiwan for a possible invasion.
And the post-invasion running of things. Yeah, he was building up a core of officers who could take over the running of the country, the civil economy, education, transport, health, and so on. Yeah, Kerr's Formosa unit had a staff of about 50, and they produced these civil affairs handbooks, operational field maps, and lots of training materials. And then in 1944, Kerr says the High Command lost interest in Formosa and the training program was dropped from high priority. A little later, the research unit was disbanded and the officers and men scattered to other schools, to other areas.
So Kerr would be sent to Taiwan within a year for the handover and post-war years, not in the way he thought he was originally going to be in Taiwan. If they had invaded, he would have had a very different role, I'm assuming. But he did eventually end up in Taiwan, where he got the material for that famous book, Formosa Betrayed. But let's take a closer look at Operation Causeway. All of these what-ifs are fascinating, right? So let's assume enemy communications have been taken out. You got bombing from the air, carrier groups from the Philippines, naval bombardment from all the ships. The Americans have total air and navy supremacy. And then D-Day on Taiwan. So where do these soldiers, Marines land?
Okay, so there are 4 beachheads. Let's see if you know these. You probably go there for fun. Southernmost is Taiwan's favorite beach resort.
Oh, I was just there. Kending, the end of the Hengchun Peninsula, Pingtung County.
That's the first spot. Next one, moving up the coast, still in Pingtung County. It's Fangliao Township.
Okay.
I don't recall the beach.
Fangliao doesn't have a beach where you or I would like hang out and swim, but there is a spot of either pebbles or something where you could. Yeah, I can see him coming in there.
Okay. And then a little bit further up, Donggang.
Donggang right now is a harbor, but I can nearby. I can imagine a landing there. Yeah.
Okay. Then go to the other side of the Galping River, and you're south of Kaohsiung, but within striking distance. What's the beach?
It's right now occupied by a massive oil refinery, but that area is called Lingayen, and it's relatively close to the current Kaohsiung International Airport. From there, you would move up, and you'd be in Fengshan, be in a very good position for taking Kaohsiung.
Okay, so that's 4 spots from Kending at the bottom up to Kaohsiung.
Yeah, wow. But had that have happened, it would have been catastrophic for those living in Kaohsiung, Pingtung, southern Taiwan. If you think about like the carnage on Okinawa, right, where a quarter, maybe as much as a quarter of the people perish. Yeah. I guess we owe MacArthur a big thank you for leapfrogging Taiwan and letting the island, as he said, wither on the vine.
Yeah, Kaohsiung dodged a bullet. You're right about Okinawa. It was the last big battle of the Pacific War, the Typhoon of Steel, as it was called, and on such a scale that it impacted heavily on Taiwan.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, the Typhoon of Steel, Okinawa, and we will be looking at that and other World War II stories in our next podcast.
Bonus stories, including New Zealand and Mexican aviators.
Okay, looking forward to that. You've been listening to Formosa Files. I'm Eric Michael Smith.
I'm John Ross.
Catch you next time.
Bye.